I'm David Philp. Who am I? Well, I'm BIM Director for a company called AECOM for Europe, Middle East, Africa and India. And I've also had the pleasure for the last 5 years as well as working with the UK government and the UK BIM Task Group in terms of this journey towards this thing called Level 2 BIM, which I'm sure you heard about this morning. And I've also started along with the Scottish government as well in terms of their journey towards BIM as well. So it's quite interesting. You know, we get the pleasure of actually traveling around the world and seeing where people are going. And I think wherever we go, we're seeing everybody in terms of built environment and a journey towards digital transformation, starting to think about, you know, a built environment that's both digitized, virtualized, and start to think more and more about better outcomes in terms of what we're doing. Again, it doesn't matter where we go in terms of, you know, this year alone, we've been in Australia, and again, the other side in the west coast of the US, everybody's starting to think about a journey. And we're seeing right at the heart of it is an enabler, and that's what it is, this thing called building information modeling. And you're probably thinking, well, actually, what's that got to do with smart and connected cities? So my job for the next, I think, Mr. Chair, next 40 Scottish minutes, is to try and talk about, you know, what does this actually look like? And how does it fit into you? You've probably heard from David Jellings this morning, this thing called Level 2 BIM. You know, it's always about a journey plan. It'll continue to grow in terms of what that looks like. And how does that start to upscale to move from thinking about individual assets to start to think more and more about how it fits into that smart, connected city agenda. You probably can't see this, but it looked fine this morning when I printed it, but I'm no expert in smart cities. This is kind of my take in terms of what it is. We all know that, you know, there's a move, if you like, towards the city environment. 70% by 2050 will live in a city. I mean, it's only recently that I myself have lived in a city. I live in Scotland, a place called Stirling, that only recently actually itself became a city. And you kind of look in terms of how that's grown over the years in terms of a more elderly population, their infrastructure is having to adapt to. And I think whatever we see, there's probably three key things in terms of BIM, smart cities that kind of drive us and how we can actually start to think how we use our data better to support. And the key things we're seeing is, you know, actually it's about outcomes. You know, how do we start to think about more sustainability, start to think about greenhouse gas emissions? How can we model things more altruistic in terms of what we're doing? How do we actually create better places to live, a better experience in terms of what we do, how we live there as well? And I think the big part, and this is where we're seeing the drive from governments, I'm sure you've heard it today, is how do we get more intelligent infrastructure? You look at projects that are going round about London just now, high speed 2, you think, well, you know, that's going to be operational around about 2026. What's going to run on it? How do they maintain a legacy of over a century? How do you start to future-proof your assets as well? So there's big challenges out there in terms of what that looks like. So actually, you know, there's a huge, you know, no matter where we go, this whole smart city agenda is real. So actually, what is a smart city? I mean, I try to give my thoughts in terms of from a BIM perspective, in terms of, you know, I see, we're out in Stockholm last week and we heard the same thing. People were talking about a journey to level 3 in the Nordics. And actually, one of the big things that came up actually is very much about that sort of concept of a mirror, holding a, you know, the mirror up to yourself and understanding, you know, what are the needs of its people as they adapt and change as well. How does it become agile? How does it start to respond and adapt? So we start to think about, you know, bringing the data set in, being able to analyze it. So we start to actually think about asset intelligence. I think that's a key thing. We move from that world of building information modeling to start to think more and more about how we use the data for asset intelligence. And start to think about some of the new commodities around about that as well. And the big things we're seeing is occupancy levels, occupancy density. So we're starting to think about new data sets that are coming as well as operational carbon. A big part of this conference as well is integration. And I think the big part in terms of that hyper connectivity, it's the usual suspects about energy, transport, but I think more and more that concept of the digital citizen that's going to integrate as well. And obviously a big part of that is in that level 3 BIM agenda as well. And actually the big thing, you know, level 2, if you like, is about a series of what we call deterministic data exchanges. With the world of level 3 BIM, we're starting to thinking more and more about real-time information exchanges from so many multiple sources. And I think it's moving away as well. You know, it's starting to think about that world of, you know, mobile, and starting to think more and more about, you know, sensor-rich infrastructure as well. And the big part for us, we often hear the term big data, but I think for me the big challenge, and this I think has been the success of level 2 BIM, is starting to think more and more about open data, the transparency, and indeed the ingenuity of people if they get access to all these big and open data sets. I think we're also seeing as well this convergence with the agenda of Industry 4.0. We're seeing in Germany the likes of Bosch and Siemens that are starting to move to new manufacturing that, again, sensor-rich and agile in terms of what they're doing. I think one of the best places when we talk about smart cities and the BIM agenda I'd certainly seen in my travels was probably a smart country in terms of Estonia. We want to go across there, talk about BIM, but actually we saw what really good infrastructure could do when you start to tie up, if you like, the digital construction asset in terms of the building, along with, if you like, in terms of the intelligent infrastructure they're putting in, especially telecommunications, the security around about, but also the whole concept of how they trade in their data. Almost a concept, you could put it into hibernation, and if you wish, open it up in another country. I think there was some amazing stuff there in terms of the behavioural changes around about how they use their data as well. So we can start to imagine what that looks like as well. The other big thing we've seen is more and more in terms of this concept of digital citizenship around about BIM, and start to think more and more about, we use some big heavy apps for design analysis, but they've got to become more and more app related. They've got to start to think about more, if you like, almost the wearable technology. That's my daughter on the left-hand side. In terms of the whole modelling concept, she's 9 years old. It's a relatively easy concept here. She can do it relatively easy. She can do it hyper-connected with her friends online. And it's not about ownership anymore. It's about wanting to access data in real time. So I think we've got to think about more and more the behavioural aspects of it. We talk about process, we talk about the technology, but for the next generation that's coming into this, the whole concept, can we give them an industry to come into that's going to be fit for purpose for them? You probably heard from David Jellings this morning the concept of building information in terms of that data hierarchy and the scalability of it. If we start to think down the bottom right, in terms of BIM, maybe drilling down into a room, a structure component, or element in a tunnel, but starting to upscale as well, and the linkage of that unification between BIM and geospatial. So we're starting to think more and more about upscaling, connecting data sets, and I think that starts to, when you start to think about blending the data, we start to think about how that can be imagined in the context of a smart city. And I think one of the things that are key to this, and I think one of the things that level 2 BIM's been good, is creating standards. The standards and open data standards in terms of level 2 BIM have been fantastic. It's made sure everybody's playing, and it lets everybody play in the same way. So that's been key to us, trying to create those same standards for everybody to play. And we're starting to see more and more that connection between the data sets as well. We think we're already doing some aspects of it as well in terms of AECOM. This is a new city out in India, Dolra, where we're starting to link up, that world of, we're doing the modeling in terms of, both in terms of graphical modeling, along with all the metadata to it. We're starting to think about the geographic data, but we're also tying within there that sensor-rich aspects as well, starting to cast in the sensors and make sure that we can, often through relational data, start to bring together our mapping models, our models in terms of the physical assets there, in terms of buildings and structures, along with all this sensor-rich data coming there. So we are starting to see emergence of that move from level 2 to level 3 BIM. So what's BIM got to do with this all? Well, you start to think of it, as we create these models, in terms of better building construction, we're starting to think more and more about the operational model as well. Starting to think about that asset intelligence modeled. This is a project we've just picked up. It's obviously Sydney Harbour, where we're building through that BIM-related thing, that whole concept of an asset information model. And we start to think about that in the context of, during that operation stage, the amount of information that we are now starting to get in terms of BMS systems, SCADA. So we're starting to think more and more about interoperability of not just software, but hardware systems as well. What do these interfaces start to look like? So level 2 was very much about interoperability of technology and software, but with level 3, we're starting to also have to think about the protocols of the hardware within there as well. So actually this whole thing called BIM, as we start to think about the operational data sets, especially in terms of beyond delivery, are starting to think more and more about data, if you like, in some degree of almost the DNA of our assets and our built environment. We can start to use the smart analytics and start to think more and more about how BIM can be used to analyse behavioural analysis. You can start to see there this project in Denver that's starting to use the model and start to use it to see actually how are people using that asset and how can we refine it to get better outcomes. And I think that's a big thing. We're seeing more and more a move to outcome-driven performance through BIM. And I think as we move from level 2, that's probably the big shift that we're starting to see. This slide, I think, probably ties back to some of the concept that David Jellings is talking about this morning, talking about a web of buildings in terms of how we connect different BIM schemas together and need to have all these different sort of open schemas that's going to allow us to actually happen. You can see there in terms of industry foundation class, city GML, all these different formats, but we're starting to think more and more about the whole agenda of data integration and actually trying to make that really an imperative. At this moment in time, it can be often, I don't know if the term's like a cottage industry in terms of there's that select few, but it's so important that we can get the open data formats right, that interoperability, if we're going to move things on. So level 2, we say it's a minimum standard. Obviously, UK government is aiming for it by 2016. It's helped us start to think more and more about how we use structured data, how we use it better. And I think the big part for me is starting to think about data provenance and how we can actually think about data verification and validation, exchanging information consistently. And you look at the UK in terms of construction, we've got, 3 million people there. It's a big challenge to get them data ready, if you like. So these last 5 years, building level 2 standards, is trying to get industry ready, starting to think about computer readable data to support fast decision-making processes. And it's also been trying to create this platform for level 3, or this concept of digital built Britain. Hands up, how many folk have heard about digital built Britain? So, relatively few, I would say 90%. Mr. Chair, would you agree with that? Yeah, okay, maybe it was only 50, but in my head it looked like that. But it's really, if you haven't read it, it's worth it to read it. It's taking the whole, if you like, construction industry from the world of analog transactions to that, starting to look at that whole digital economy and what level 3 can help imagine within there. It's the eponymous wedge, we've got to show it as part of the legal thing. You can see there how we've moved from level 0 to level 2, and the standards for level 2 are just complete. You hear people saying we're doing level 3. Well, how can you do something that we just finished standards for level 2? So we're starting to work under the guise of Digital Built Britain and starting to build, if you like, the whole agenda around about level 3 BIM. And you can see some of the things there in terms of what level 3 starts to imagine. But we start to think about something that's cloud-based, online, and probably one of the big terms is around about that whole automation process. Starting to think of, automation of procurement, tendering process. I think the big part for me is that last piece, post-occupancy, automation and productivity, real time, how are our assets performing? Often you think about it, what do we rely on at this moment in time? Maybe a soft landings process, it's a survey with staff after they get the keys after a year. We're starting to think more and more about how we can automate that process. So you're starting to think about performance data sets that are coming in with well. So this is level 2, if you like. We're starting to think about how we can combine 2 data sets about our assets, capital expenditure and operational, thinking about total expenditure thinking and how we can use data to start to think more about a project outcome, in terms of that life cycle cost, whole life cost analysis. So with level 3, we're starting to add in new data sets, as you can see there, operational and performance data. And we move out again to level 4, we can start to think more and more about social outcomes, which is a big, big thing. How do we get better performing hospitals, schools? So actually, we need less of them. You think about it, if we can understand with an object such as glazing, does that improve patient recovery time? And think about what that will mean to savings within the NHS. So you can start to see in terms of often, it's quite, you think how surreal it is across there. The whole piece in terms of that whole design and build, it's only really worth about 20% of that total expenditure. 80% of it is tied up in OPEX. And that's what level 2 seek to do. How do we get better savings, at 15 to 20% across that total expenditure? We move into level 3, where we're starting to think about improvement in terms of operational performance, argue about 33%, but if you multiply it through a portfolio, typically could be savings in there of 300%. So you start to think about level 4. We start to think about improvements on the social budget of the UK. This is where we get real savings. So levels, if you like, 0 through to level 3, sought to think about better outcomes in terms of assets. But when we get to level 4, we're starting to think about better social outcomes as well. So really our simple formula is, it's not just about the smart assets, it's also about the people data, and that gives us that maximised business outcomes in terms of what we're doing. However, I think one of the things we've suffered with the whole BIM piece is people have saw it as the next move in terms of geometrical progression from 2D to 3D. And actually, we see it as much more of a transformative change in what we're doing. It should disrupt what we're doing. It should change commercial models. And it should be about the big data, the open data, but actually start to think about how we can turn all this data from our assets, bring them together, and turn it into some degree of meaningful insight. I don't know how well you can see this, but we mentioned level 2 as being deterministic, our feedback waves in terms of bringing models together. I mean, often we're relying upon data that is maybe out of date by a week, 2 weeks. So level 3, we're thinking about real-time data exchanges, often from sensors within assets that are coming in. We can start to mine that. We can start to think about more probabilistic for all this scenario planning as well. And we start to think about absolute, if not probabilistic. The big piece around about that is we move into that scale, we also can start to imagine the automation of procurement process as well. And these are really key. So we can start to see with level 3 that whole reshaping of the built environment, decisions at lighting speed, and the big part we can start to think about automation of a lot of the construction process. So some of the opportunities for level 3 that tie into this, making exchanges that are faster, more efficient in terms of what we're doing. One of the things we've suffered from in terms of level 2 BIM as well is we often put things in separate packages. We transfer our non-graphical information for things such as COBie, which you heard from David this morning, yet we'll package some of the graphical data up separately. How can we bring it together, give it real provenance in what we're doing? How can we do it online in terms of the cloud, in terms of different ontologies, making sure that this is very much global in terms of classifications. And probably the big thing about level 3 as well is that whole data generated by that whole Internet of Things. So level 3 is very much about sensors and Internet of Things. So I don't know how well you can see it in the screens here, but this is level 2, capital delivery data through a series, if you like, of prescribed transactional contracts if we do. With level 3, we're starting to think about the operational activity data and starting to think about performance management data. Now that starts to imagine you can actually change your contracts to think more and more about servitization and outcome-based forms of contract, which are a massive piece. So we're starting to upscale it now. You can see in terms of we're moving away from building information modeling, maybe in the context of a single asset, to start to think about portfolios, to smart cities, and start to think about actually a strategic level. So the data standards, the processes making that happen are so key. And you can start to see there as we move out in terms of level 3, we're starting to think about bringing in big data using dependency analytics for buildings, transport, water, and power. And we get to that red line and said actually when we've got the move to people in level 4. So we're starting to see key to all this is about that interoperability we mentioned, and it's cross-sector. Starting to think about smart grids and the whole piece around about the smart city agenda within there. So we can start to see it scaling up, starting with a building that's maybe the objects as a microphone up to the whole maybe an asset piece to bring it to portfolio up to the smart city. So I think BIM's got a big part to play within there. However, there's huge challenges. We mentioned projects such as High Speed 2. How do they future-proof the requirements that they're putting out to the marketplace at this moment in time? It'll take over a decade to construct it. How do we make sure that the data standards, as they change, they can start to refresh? And you think about it, as we move into the operational assets, start to think about the social data, how do we make sure that actually improves that experience as we start to think about a move into level 4? So huge considerations for clients as they move on that journey. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but this is part of that whole, if you like, digital built Britain plan that was saying actually we've got to think about technical standards, but at the same time as we start to think about the whole smart city side, thinking more and more about the commercial model around about it as well. What does that look like? Where are the opportunities that sit around about it? And how do we make sure we can take advantage of these new validated and real-time data sets? I think it's fair to say we're all learning from other industries, especially in terms of Formula One retail. They've got assets such as a car. They've got all these real-time data coming in from a telemetry that are giving us better outcomes. And I think this is a big thing for us, this whole concept of Internet of Things and how we can start to bring all that telemetry into our buildings, and infrastructure as well. How do we bring that? We see it already. You look at it in terms of, there's a pile cage within there, and there's a strain gauge that's embedded within it. And it starts to put some new challenges within us. How do we embed sensors within there? How do we make sure we've got protocols right around all these new interface systems, all these huge amount of operating systems around about it? Where do we store it? Clients even struggle with level 2 in terms of storage. So we think about the huge amount of data that's going to be required as we shift into this level 3. And at the far right, actually, we've got to think about these new integrated contracts that sit around it as well. So level 2 is thinking about that integration of telemetry. And a big part of this is around about total cost and thinking more and more about the carbon piece as well. So performance and operation of assets in real time is fundamental to that level 3 piece. So you can see there in terms of things we've talked about, I think one of the big things around about there is the whole cyber security piece as well. There's a wrapper around level 2 BIM in terms of of how if we transact PAS 1192 Part 5, but we've got to grow up on that as we start to think about performance contracting as well. How do we make sure we do that mindful in terms of putting that city overlay? At the same time, we're starting to think more and more about cloud working as well and what that means. Actually, we start to think about BIM, upscaling it. We start to see more and more how we get these ultra rapid design cycles. We can do more and more of that optioneering of things. And the whole piece around about predictive analysis as well. So we're starting to think about telemetry, sensors, cloud-based, Internet of Things, and indeed the cloud. I think one of the big things we're seeing is the whole, I don't know if it's been mentioned, the gamification of the city as well. We're starting to see gamification in terms of BIM. And I thought this is quite interesting. This is a question that High Speed 2 asks. Actually, can we take some of the, the concepts from gaming in terms of that whole transparency, competitive, and starting to test things more right at the very beginning, both in terms of a project level and at a city level as well. Let's be honest, we kind of gamify it all the time, in terms of, it might be in terms, you can see the model there, there's 2 people out running. It's kind of transparent. It's got real-time performance data within there. You can almost start to think about the automation from it. Can you take that same model into the smart city that we actually think about all these data sources coming in, and we can start to think about the gamification, it's transparent, and it leads into that automation process as well. So we're starting to see a convergence, I think, of some of the gaming technologies coming together with BIM as well as we move into level 3. And I think this is one of the big things we see. I'm sure of these, that whole concept of nest or hive that's constantly learning. But we look in terms of the whole tender process, procurement, in terms of construction. This can be something that takes us years. Why can't we take that same big data gamification construct and bring it in there to think about a personalised, automated experience? We're constantly learning, bringing all these data in from the model to start thinking of that automated experience. And I think that will start to push in as well. New business models, and again, this takes the same process. This is a bit of work we've been doing over with the University of the Politecnico in Milano. You can start to see there, bringing that serious gaming. Actually get a surgeon to actually try and operate something within there. Not thinking about, this is, does it fit overall the equipment into it, but can actually carry out something that gives me better performance within there as well. So more and more a move towards that business model simulation. And as we mentioned, that move, if you like, in terms of new business models that are very much outcome driven. And I think that's just a nice one to skip that one there for Mr. Chair. But this is a bit fun, and I think it's something worth doing. This is something we've done with the BIM task group. We took the overlay of the tube map, and we're trying to put the timelines, zone 1, 2011 to 2016, and then coming out. What does the whole future start to look like, and start to plot some of the things and how these key themes come together. You can see there as we moved out to, this is our prediction a few years ago, starting to bring in BIM in terms of the smart grids around about it, more and more about model views, digital planner works, and the technology. So we're starting to see very much that convergence of the data sets that are coming together as well. So a quick canter through what we're seeing, but we think there's a real symbiosis between BIM and smart connected cities.
Perfect. A healthy 20 minutes was
excellent.
Perfect. Thank you.